morning. I'm Donnie Nichols. My wife Kim and I are both Missouri Master Naturalists, and I want to talk a little bit about native plants in Missouri and the importance of native plants. And this morning we have Dax and Elin. They're a couple of our grandkids that live in Olathe, Kansas, and they're here for the weekend, so they're going to help me with this presentation. So kids, if we were out on the prairie and we were lost, is there any kind of a plant that could help us find our way?
Yes.
What would that be?
Compass plant.
Compass plant. Well, these you can see are kind of, hold that up for you. These are a little bit kind of wilted because we cut these this morning, we don't have them in the garden. But this compass plant has leaves, and if these leaves were sticking out, they align north and south, and that's why it's called a compass plant. So if we were out on the prairie and lost, we could say, Grandpa, let's find a compass plant, and we would look at that and we would know north and south, so we'd know east and west, and we wouldn't be lost anymore, would we? And another thing about this plant, native plants are so important because they have really, really deep root systems, so you don't have to water them, you don't have to have fertilizer when you plant them, so it's important to do that. This plant is a compass plant that gets taller than I do and has a big yellow flower on it when it grows up, but the root system is about 15 foot deep in the ground. That's almost 3 times as tall as Grandpa is. So that's why they're so helpful in our gardens, because they don't have to water them. And another thing, the Native Americans, the Indians, were afraid to camp by these compass plants because they thought they attracted lightning, and so they wouldn't camp by them, but they didn't really attract lightning. So if we were out and wanted some chewing gum, what would we do?
Take this, or part of it, and rip it off.
And just break it apart, yeah. Dax, I don't know if you heard him, what'd you say we'd do?
We'll break it apart, then leave it, and then come back, and when it comes back, it's chewing gum.
We would just break it off, and inside of this is a real sappy. This is a Silphium family plant, and it has sap that comes out, and it gets clear, and after about 20 minutes, we would come back by, and the Native Americans didn't have chewing gum. They couldn't go to Walmart and get it, but they would take this and chew it, and it was really, that's what they used for chewing gum. So Dax, is there any other plants maybe that's interesting that we should look at today in our garden?
Yes.
Okay. What's that plant?
Rattlesnake Master.
Okay.
Right here.
Rattlesnake Master. You can see that? If you can see this, and maybe you have to close it up a little bit, on the sides of this there's little bitty thorns. It looks like thorns, and that's why it's got the name Rattlesnake Master. This time of the year there's not a whole lot blooming in our garden, but this plant gets about this tall, and it has a really nice white little bloom on it and a seed pod, and it's really pokey, and so that's why they called it Rattlesnake Master. The Native Americans would use it. They would take the root and then make an antidote for different poisons, but it had nothing to do with rattlesnakes. Never once used the Rattlesnake Master. Elin, what other kind of plant can you find here? Coneflower. Okay. Well, this coneflower is something that all Native American tribes, there was hundreds of different tribes of Indians across the United States, and every tribe used this plant for lots of reasons. And we today use this. All of you kids, all of the people watching this, probably sometime or another, have used this plant because it is the family Echinacea. Native Americans would use it for colds, for cuts, for fevers, everything you can think of, they used it. But today, if you look at your cough medicines and cough drops, you will find Echinacea listed on this as a product of this. And because this plant, you can get that compound from the roots of this plant. Another interesting thing about this, it has beautiful flowers. Like this is one kind of coneflower, and this is a different species of coneflower. Right here, there's pale blue and prairie coneflowers, but they have seed pods, and they're really pretty. But the seed pods they would use to comb their hair. They could make combs out of them, and also they had. If you were back in the days, if you were a medicine man in the tribe, you were considered very important, and you would know that you could take the roots of this plant, dig it up, they have big old roots, and you could smash it up, and it is a heat retardant. So if I could dig that root up and smash it, and it has a kind of a white latex thing, it's a heat retardant. I could put it on my hands, and I could walk over to the fire and pick up a live coal, because it would keep you from getting burnt. And so that would be big medicine back in those days, because I would know that and the other people wouldn't. Dax, show me another plant that maybe we could use, or that Native Americans used. What's that one called?
Dogbane.
Dogbane. So this is in the milkweed family, and if you can see, we had to cut this one off. It has a milky sap out in it. But Native Americans called it Indian hemp. And the reason was you could take this plant and break these, and take a rock and smash it, and it has little bitty tiny fibers. In fact, your granny one time is at a class, she could take this plant and use it to build a fire. And the reason she could do that, she would take this plant, mash it with a rock, there's little fine strands, which Native Americans also used for thread. They could use them for thread, they're so fine. But she could take them, she could take these fine threads, braid them together, make it like a little rope. She could take a stick, bend that stick, use this to hold it together, and then she could use it as a bow to make a fire, how the Indians used to make fire with this. Really neat plant, very attractive to butterflies. It has a seed pod on it that looks a lot like a seed pod on milkweed. That's the fluffy stuff that blows around. But this, the Native Americans called this the plant that burns in your hand, because it has the fluffy seeds just like milkweed, and you put it in your hand, you can light it, but it doesn't burn hot enough it wouldn't even hurt your hand. So that's kind of a neat plant. What's this plant right here, Elin? Do you remember what that is?
Indigo.
Indigo. This is another neat plant. This one happens to be blue indigo, but we have pale blue, we have cream, and we have white indigo in Missouri. The Native Americans called this Gasatho. I like Indian names because Indians had more sense with their names. They had a reason, because when this goes to seed, it has a pod on it that gets about that big, and it dries, and the seeds are inside that pod. And Gasatho means rattle. So you could take this plant, if the seeds are not, I could shake it, and you could hear it rattle. So the Indians called it Gasatho because it means rattle. The Indians would take those seeds, they would grind them up and put them with buffalo fat, and they would make kind of a lotion thing, and it'd rub on the kids. It would help for different reasons. And plus they would take the roots, the stems of this, and they would cut it up and put it with sycamore bark, and they would use it to treat knife wounds and if they got cut by a knife or an axe. So that was good. So some other plants we have in the garden, we have a bunch of different things, but the importance of planting native plants is because the insects, if there's a lot of studies now, so many things depend on insects, and they always have. There's a food web or a food chain, and everything starts at the bottom, like insects are eaten by many, many, many things, like birds eat them and all kinds of things eat them, and it involves, and the whole food chain is affected by, but the insects today are fastly disappearing because there's no native plants for them to get their pollen on or their food from. So it's important that we take care of native gardens. In fact, Kim and I just planted another 15 by 25 foot native garden to increase native gardens. So I would encourage you that if you're going to plant flowers around your house, why not plant native plants? You don't have to fertilize them, you don't have to water them, they're beautiful, you can get many different kinds, there's all kinds of good sources to look for native plants, and it's very beneficial to our wildlife and to our health as people. You know, it's been said, many scientists said insects are so important to our ecosystem, and these plants are so important to the insects, that if all the insects on the world disappeared, that the human race might last only about 6 months to a year. But if all the people on the earth disappeared, then everything else on the earth would probably thrive within 6 months or a year, because we have ruined so many of our environments. So it's very important to plant native plants. And some good resources for native plants is you can go to the Missouri Prairie Foundation. They have a Grow Native program. You can look that up at moprairies.org, and you can learn all about native plants and where to get them if you want to plant some. Merv Wallace with Missouri Wildflowers is another great source. We do a lot of things with Merv, and he can tell you all about how to plant native plantings and how beneficial they are. So we'll show you one other little plant. These are great, and native plants, you can get them if they need full sun or in the shade. We'll show you a plant that is very helpful if you have a shady place that's hard to grow things. And Granny and I, or Kim, we'll have to call her Granny, won't we, say the Kim kids? Granny and I planted some of this stuff. So you come over here, we'll show you a good plant. Plus, this is a really neat plant. This is in the bee balm family, Ohio horse mint. I mean, there's so many beautiful flowers, and if it was later in the year, these would really be blooming, and you can see all the neat flowers. But here's one that's good to plant in shade. When when we moved here, this was just barren dirt and it was so shady we couldn't get anything to grow. So Kim and I planted wild ginger. We planted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little bitty sprigs of wild ginger. And this is how it's grown, and it sets a good ground cover, and lots of different insects and things use this. So just some of the importance of using native plants. And so I would encourage you all, if you have the opportunity to look up some information, and if you're interested in planting some plants, use Missouri native plants. Thank you.